Hi everyone. Tackling a Microsoft 365 tenant-to-tenant migration can feel like navigating a maze. So many permissions, roles, and consents to get right. Today, we're going to make that journey a lot clearer. Jeff Shahan from Quest is here to guide us through the ins and outs of on-demand migration, how it requests permissions, keeps your data secure, and gives you control without slowing you down. Jeff, let's get started.
Greetings. My name is Jeff Shahan, and I'll be covering deep dive on ODM permissions today. So for a real quick agenda, I'll be setting the stage, kind of giving you some background about on-demand migration. Then I'm going to talk about the required permissions, and we'll kind of dissect them. And then I'll try to talk about how we can balance security and functionality, and then how to customize those application consents if there's a permission that you need to deal with, and then how to maintain compliance and control utilizing some of the controls that are available. First, we're setting the stage. The ownership versus the requirements. So Microsoft owns the platform and the permissions. We have to work within the APIs and the permissions that they give us. They built the APIs, they set the standard for the security model, they built the RBAC controls that we have to work within. On-demand migration needs access to that Microsoft platform so it can do what it's designed to do, and that's migrate content. On-demand migration is a very mature application. It was released on March 19th, 2018. I was shocked when I looked this up. I had not realized it had been out so long. It is a multi-tenant software solution. It is an application as a service. It's built on Azure microservices. It primarily uses application service principles to do its task. Most of the permissions are application-based permissions. There is a limited set of delegated permissions that we're leveraging. So for a quick history, initially we had only two consents. So when we first released it, we had two consents, one that handled mail and one that handled SharePoint and the Azure directory itself. We also required a service account and password for both the source and target platforms in order to do PowerShell remote access, EWS access. We had to have a GA account for these, and MFA was not supported. So didn't get a lot of pushback back then, but today it would be incredible if we did. Least level access rules didn't apply, and we didn't get a lot of pushback back then. Today, we have 6 core application consents, one for each core module. There are a few additional modules that are now available that require their own standalone consent. For a service account and password, we need it for 2 functions now. One of them is to initialize the storage for OneDrive. The issue being that OneDrive storage, the only way to do it is via remote PowerShell. There isn't an application API way to do that. Public folders require an account because that's the visibility we have by way of MAPI into those public folders. Least level access, we've designed a source and target consent to grant, minimal for the source, full for the target. We now support Exchange native RBAC, so you can delegate the access to just the mailboxes you want us to access. Coming soon, we'll fully support site selected for SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive. We haven't released it, but it is available for Teams and SharePoint at this time. So let's dig into the permissions. So to break the consents down, in the source tenant, we use minimal consents. They're primarily based for read for all operations, with the exception of a few, and I'll point those out as we dig through it. For the target tenant, those are primarily read-write permissions for all of those consents. So the basic consent has, basic full directory, read as a user, read write. As you can see, everything's read write. When you look at minimal, we've broken it down to read. This is where I split them both out, and you can kind of see the one I get questioned about a lot is Exchange manages an app. The only thing that permission allows is for an application to make a remote PowerShell connection into Exchange. What PowerShell applets are returned to that application are controlled by native Exchange RBAC. The role management read-write, that is used by the discovery task. It is hard-coded into the tool that when a discovery task runs, that it checks to make sure that it's a member of the Exchange admin role. If it's not, the task will put itself in there so it can actually access all of those mailboxes when it runs a remote PowerShell in order to enumerate the directory. Mailbox permissions, we've got 3 of them available. So we have the full minimum. We also have a custom RBAC, which I'll be talking about later. That removes the bulk of the permissions from the consent, and then everything is granted by way of native delegation within Exchange using RBAC for applications. So digging deep on the other 2 core consents, we have full access as an application. That allows the application to access all mailboxes unlimited within the Exchange directory. You can use an application access policy in order to limit what mailboxes the application can see. And once you've implemented an application access policy, the application can't see any more mailboxes than what you've defined in those groups. You should know that Microsoft is retiring EWS access. We are actually leveraging EWS to do this, but not making native EWS calls. So when they retire, application access policies go away. OneDrive permissions, as you can see, they're pretty basic. Can I read files? Do I have site full control? Site full control is one that we get pushback on. It is a requirement if you'd like us to migrate the permissions and the versions of documents. Without that permission, we cannot access those. So here's kind of a breakdown of what everything is for SharePoint. Very similar, though we read sites and term stores that we didn't have to read otherwise. Site full control, as I covered before, is critical for accessing the versions, so the version controls. If you remove it, which you certainly can, we will not be able to migrate the permissions or the versions, and there's no workaround to get it any other way. Teams actually leverages the SharePoint platform to migrate the SharePoint content, so it uses that module to do the work. However, there's a lot of Teams-related things that there's a laundry list of consents that are granted. Microsoft, since they built that native in Office 365, they had more time to come up with what permissions and how they wanted to break things down. We actually use 4 different APIs, so instead of just using Graph or using Graph for SharePoint, there's also a Graph for Notes, there's a Graph for Teams, OneDrive, OneNote, excuse me. So we want to balance security with functionality. So there are some considerations. The core workloads, use the minimal for the source tenants and the full for the target tenants. You could actually use the minimal for a target tenant. You just have to make all of the teams, make all of the SharePoints sites, make all of the accounts would have to exist. They'd already have to have mailboxes. So it would be extremely limiting and not very convenient. We can leverage custom RBAC for source or the target. Again, if you're leveraging for a target, that means the mailboxes have to exist, have to be mailboxes in order for them to fall within a scope of a native Exchange RBAC role. SharePoint site selected will be coming soon to production. It does exist within the product today. So it is something that there'll be a knowledge base article that I'll give you a link to at the end. So you can actually see how to configure and leverage it today. There are quite a few limitations, and I'll cover those in a little bit. AIP protected content, we can migrate this the sensitivity labels today. That is an additional consent to be able to do that. Again, you'll want to use the read consent for the source and the write consent for the target. The project wizard has some defaults that we recommend which consent you use for the source or the target to reduce over consenting. When we first released the minimal and full consents, I had experienced customers consent to all of the consents for each. And at that time, we had a legacy consent that said neither full nor minimal. And the logic built within the tool was to use the least level consent granted for each tenant. So that caused basic functions to fail. The service accounts that we leverage as part of the tool, like I said, we only need it to provision SharePoint. Anybody can run a PowerShell script to do that as long as they're a SharePoint admin. We need to know the username and password. That account cannot have MFA because an application can't know something and have something. It also must have the SharePoint role. So it's a powerful account with a lot of authority with no MFA. Public folders, we need an account, but we don't need the password for that account. So MFA is supported on the account, and it just has to be the owner of the root public folder. OneDrive provisioning, they only need to be provisioned in the target. They don't need to be provisioned in the source. They exist in the source. The account for public folders, we need one for both the source and the target. We don't need to know the password. There's no roles, but it does need to be licensed for Exchange Online. So it has to have a mailbox. So additional customization. So these are some additional consents that you could remove if you chose to. I kind of commented as part of the presentation earlier, but here's just kind of a list where you can. The mailbox migration custom RBAC consent, it will allow you to limit the mailboxes in the tenant. You can choose this consent as part of the project wizard, or you can do it directly from the tenant interface. The consent only has directory read all, and it's not even leveraging it. There is no way to create a consent without any permissions. You have to have a stub consent. It can be used for either the source or the target. The view that you see in the right half of the screen, that is from the Open Project Wizard and how you can define which consent you're going to assign. So for a high-level process, you grant that consent into the tenant while creating that migration project. An Exchange admin can create a service principal for the mailbox migration custom RBAC consent. So we create the consent, the enterprise application in the intra directory. The Exchange admin creates a pointer in the Exchange directory back to that application consent in the intra directory. Once that's been created, he creates a management scope and then assigns the role to the application ID he just created, applying that management consent. So to remove the role management read all directory permission from the basic consent, so this right now is technical debt. We know we need to change the basic consent and remove the role management read write when we're going to be leveraging the custom RBAC. And this way is how you would do and grant the same level of access for the basic consent, so the discovery can only discover the mailboxes within scope. You'd create that same consent for the additional basic application and then create a role assignment to the same original scope. For sites.selected for SharePoint and Teams, this gives you granular control over which sites can be accessed and migrated. It's primarily used for a source tenant because the target tenant needs to have sites exist already. You can only do discovery from a file. So in other words, you have to have the site to be able to discover it. There is a laundry list of issues with it and the limitations that it can't do. So be sure to consider those if you're going to implement this. In your tenant, you're going to modify the default consents on that there's a PowerShell script that's included with that knowledge base article I'll be pointing to a little later. And then you have to manually grant administrative access over each one of those sites. There is a PowerShell script to do that as well. Multiple organizations for multiple migrations. So if you are running more than one migration, so in this case, I've got one where we're migrating into my tenant and another one we're migrating out of my tenant. They could be run by separate partners. You would want to create a separate Quest on-demand organization and have each project in each of those organizations. And how can we handle maintaining a little more control? So Quest does have an RBAC module built into the tool itself. So we have some built-in roles that are very powerful. That they are on the left. The on-demand administrator, that is the role you are granted when you create an organization. It doesn't get any more powerful than that role. The migration administrator owns and has access to all functions within the migration tool itself. The viewer can only look at the configuration and what's going on and can't make any changes. Perfect for a project manager to look through. We have a new feature that hasn't quite been released yet. It's the self-service for device migration users. This is a self-service portal that you'll be able to allow the end users to schedule when they want to have their device migrated. Give them a little more control. Some of the features of the RBAC is you can assign Entra users the roles, or you can assign groups the roles. So the group was designed for the self-service migration, but it can be done for users as well. We also have a PowerShell commandlet, and that respects those RBAC roles and what functions that you can do. The RBAC roles are granular enough. It is down to the task and type. So you could limit whether somebody can do a full discovery or just a discovery by file or just a rediscovery of already discovered objects. So this is an interesting case. This came from a company that had more than one project happening at the same time, and they wanted to be able to limit who had access into what as part of the migration. So the target company is the one executing the migration. The source company doesn't trust the target company. So this is the process that they use. They granted the consents to their tenant themselves. They used the ODM admin in order to do that, created RBAC, created site support if they needed to. And then they actually ran a discover by file for these users. And they did that after the target company granted access to the tenant, created that migration project. So that's when they ran those. So you can see they kind of had to work together to make this work. And all of this was handled through the custom RBAC interface. Here are some QR codes that will take you directly to the knowledge base articles on the topics that I've discussed today. And thank you very much.